Okay, let's move on to the pancreas. And I mentioned on over on the anatomy side for the endocrine system that the pancreas is both an exocrine and an endocrine gland. And of course, we're mainly going to be talking about the endocrine functions of the pancreas in this part of the course. The exocrine functions are production of digestive enzymes and other substances that help digestion occur in the small intestine. And we'll wind up covering that information when we get to the digestive system later during the semester. So the pancreas as a whole, kind of triangular in shape. It's located partially behind the stomach. You guys know where the pancreas is. And as I said, it has most of the pancreas is involved in exocrine gland functions. So exocrine glands secrete substances that pass through ducts with a T, not a K, and those get secreted onto body surfaces. In this case, it's going to be, it secretes substances onto the inside lining of the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, and those substances are involved in digestion. So the cells in the pancreas that do that are called acinar cells, and they produce a number of substances that creates this digestive enzyme-rich juice that's used for those processes. We're interested in the endocrine cells of the pancreas, and they're scattered throughout the pancreas in little spheres called the pancreatic islets, or islets of Langerhans. Langerhans was the dude who discovered these originally. The two major types of cells in these islets. So an islet is a cluster, a spherical shaped cluster of cells, and some of those are called alpha cells and some of them are beta cells. Alpha cells produce a hormone called glucagon, and beta cells produce a hormone we've all heard of, insulin. Glucagon is called a hyperglycemic hormone because what glucagon does is it raises blood sugar. Insulin lowers blood sugar, so it can also be considered a hypoglycemic hormone. I'm not real crazy about those two terms. I mean, you'll see that every once in a while where glucagon's called a hyperglycemic hormone, insulin's called a hypoglycemic hormone, but and yes, those conditions, blood sugar being too high or blood sugar being too low, would occur if you were overproducing too much of those hormones, or maybe you took an injection of too much of those hormones. Those are the conditions that they would cause. I think it's easier to learn that glucagon raises blood sugar levels, insulin lowers them. You know, just start thinking of them along those lines, because both of those hormones are involved very much in controlling your blood glucose levels. And obviously we talk about glucose a lot, so it's super, super important. And you've already heard how cortisol is important for controlling your blood glucose levels. And we heard how epinephrine and norepinephrine can raise your blood glucose levels to help you deal with short-term stress. So glucose is so important to for the cells of your body that there's more than one thing involved in controlling those levels. Okay, so this is an actual photograph of a microscopic image. We're zooming in to the pancreas, and the pancreas tissues have been dyed so that we can see things in there better. And so this is one of those pancreatic islets, and it's surrounded, the darker tissues that you see surrounding it here are, those are all acinar cells that are involved in making digestive enzymes. Where you see these little darker spots in here, each of those is a nucleus of either an alpha cell or a beta cell located inside one of these pancreatic islets. And they're really three-dimensional. You're just looking at a cross-section through one. Again, they're scattered around in the pancreas. And so now let's talk about what these two hormones do. They're both involved in helping us maintain our blood glucose levels. This is basic homeostasis. Here's what your blood glucose levels do on a regular basis. They go up and down. when your blood sugar levels are over here, they're too low, you've got to keep glucose in your blood. Your brain has got to have glucose, and so do other tissues, in order to do cellular respiration. So if your blood sugar levels are too low, then the alpha cells in the pancreas detect that, and they secrete glucagon. Its major target is the liver. Okay, and what it does is it causes the liver to produce glucose and release that into the bloodstream. So you make your own glucose. It does that through two different ways. One is called glycogenolysis, and we've heard of glycogen before in the past. Glycogen is a polysaccharide, and it's represented over here. And all glycogen are chains of glucoses that are bonded together, covalently bonded together. So glycogen is a polysaccharide that's produced in the liver. Your skeletal muscles make it as well. When you have excess glucose around, they get bonded together to form glycogen, and glycogen stores those glucoses for when they're needed later. Lysis means to split. So glucagon tells the liver cells, break apart your glycogen. So it stimulates enzymes inside the liver cells to chop apart the glycogen molecules into individual glucoses, and then those get released into the bloodstream, and that helps elevate your blood sugar levels. That's one thing. The other thing is gluconeogenesis. So we talked about that before with cortisol. That's where the liver cells actually take other kinds of molecules, non-carbohydrate molecules like amino acids and fatty acids, even lactic acid. Lactic acid, if you guys remember that from, that's a waste product that can be produced during metabolism. Takes those things and uses enzymes. There are enzymes in your liver cells that will take those molecules and convert them into glucose. So both of those things will increase the glucose levels in your bloodstream. So then your glucose levels go back up. All right, so what happens then when let's go back over here to our little fluctuating glucose levels in your bloodstream and body fluids. When you are up here, you don't want your glucose levels getting too high. High glucose levels for sustained long periods of time can wind up being toxic. And that is what occurs in people who have diabetes. And you guys know that diabetics have many various health problems. All right, so when your blood glucose levels are up, the beta cells in the pancreas detect that, and they secrete insulin. Insulin travels throughout the body, and its main targets are your fat cells, your adipose cells that you have scattered around the body, and then your skeletal muscle fibers, your skeletal muscle cells that you have all throughout the body as well. Some sources also say that insulin acts pretty strongly on the liver as well. And so what it does has many effects. It inhibits glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis that we were just talking about. So glucagon stimulates those things to help you raise your blood sugar. Well, insulin is going to help you lower your blood sugar. That's what insulin's job is going to be. So it's going to inhibit those processes. You don't want to release even more and more and more and more glucose out of your liver when your glucose levels are already high in your bloodstream. Stimulates glucose uptake into fat cells and muscle cells. So when you have elevated glucose in your bloodstream and in your other body fluids, your fat cells and your muscle cells, they don't really take that glucose up that well, unless insulin tells them to do it. So when insulin binds to its receptors on those cells, it sets off a set of events. So let's say this is a fat cell. That fat cell starts making glucose transporters, and it sticks those in its cell membrane. And now the glucoses that are outside the fat cells get transported inside those fat cells so that they can be used. Same thing goes on in your skeletal muscle fibers. So basically those cells ignore glucose. They don't have any transporters in their membranes to import the glucose unless insulin is around. Then insulin stimulates those cells to make transporter proteins for glucose and stick those in the cell membrane so that then it can actually uptake the glucose. Insulin also seems to play roles in development of the nervous system and also learning and memory as well. So there are some other roles for insulin also, but we primarily think about it as being involved in glucose, blood sugar level control. All right, you do not need insulin in order to take up glucose into all of your cells. It seems to primarily be important for your fat cells and your muscle cells. Your brain is not insulin dependent. The kidney, for example, is another tissue that is not insulin dependent. So they'll take up glucose out of the blood regardless of what your insulin levels are. Other things that insulin does, increases the use of glucose in cellular respiration. So if you've got lots of glucose around, why, yeah, you might as well break that down and use that and harness energy from it to make ATP. Insulin causes glycogen production. Okay, so we said glucagon causes glycogen to be broken down in the liver. Insulin's going to have the opposite effect. If your glucose levels are high up here, then you may as well collect that excess glucose and bond it together and store it in the liver for when you need it later. So you produce glycogen. Also, and here's something that we don't like about insulin, it stimulates your fat cells to take glucose and does chemical reactions on it and converts it over to fats for storage. So over here I was talking about how your adipocytes, when insulin is around, they take in, absorb the glucose, and guess what they do with it? They convert it over to fat so that you can store that inside those fat cells. All right, so this is a good diagram from your textbook which shows the relationship between insulin and glucagon. This is your homeostatic balance diagram. And so they're showing you over here, we'll start over here, stimulus, blood glucose levels have dropped. They're too low. You got to maintain your blood glucose levels within homeostatic ranges. So the alpha cells in the pancreas detect that. They secrete glucagon. Glucagon, main target is the liver, and it stimulates glycogenolysis, glycogen breakdown. It stimulates gluconeogenesis. The liver releases the glucose, your own glucose that you've made in your liver, and your glucose levels go back up. Now over here, what about when your glucose levels are too high or elevated? Such is what would occur, what would cause your glucose levels to be going up. The main thing that causes insulin to be secreted is, after you eat a meal. And it actually, we'll see shortly, doesn't actually have to be just a meal that's high in carbohydrates, but carbohydrates are the source of, as they get digested in your digestive system, they get converted to glucose molecules. So glucose molecules are the most potent stimulators of insulin secretion by the pancreas. So when you eat a meal, insulin gets secreted, and insulin targets again tissue cells in the body, primarily the liver and the skeletal muscles, causes them to uptake glucose. So your glucose levels go back down and you move back toward the normal homeostatic average that you're looking for. And then as your glucose levels drop down too low, such as at night you haven't eaten for a while, that's going to cause the pancreas to secrete glucagon, and you start the whole little cycle over again. Glucose levels are monitored. This diagram is showing you that you should have about 90 milligrams of glucose for every 100 milliliters of blood. So 100 milliliters, you think about a 2-liter bottle of Coke, that's 1/20th of a 2-liter bottle of Coke. So in that volume, you should have about 90 milligrams of glucose. All right, things that affect insulin release. All right, so like we've been talking about, when your blood glucose levels go up, like right after you eat a meal, especially one rich in carbohydrates, that's going to be the main thing that stimulates it. But other things do too, rising blood levels of amino acids and fatty acids, so you would also be consuming those from your foods as well. They help stimulate insulin release. Release of acetylcholine by the parasympathetic nerve fibers. That's another thing that tells the pancreas, hey, release some insulin so the skeletal muscle and the liver can absorb glucose. A number of other hormones also help increase insulin production in the pancreas. And one of these at first doesn't make a lot of sense, glucagon. Glucagon, believe it or not, actually tells the beta cells in the pancreas to secrete some insulin. And that might seem counterintuitive because glucagon and insulin have opposite effects. But when you think about it a little deeper, glucagon causes glucose to be released out of the liver, make your own glucose. And once that glucose is floating around in the bloodstream, you need some insulin around so that your skeletal muscle cells and your fat cells and your liver cells will take up some of that glucose. So when you think about it that way, it does make a little bit of a sense, but initially it seems like the opposite would be true. Epinephrine. All right, so epinephrine, we said, is involved in short-term stress responses. If you're responding to stress, you want to make sure that your skeletal muscles are taking up glucose. Well, they don't do that unless insulin is telling them to take it up. Growth hormone. If your muscles are going to grow, they need to be taking up glucose to provide the fuel, the energy that's needed to sustain that growth. So that makes sense as well. In order for growth hormone to work properly, you got to have some insulin around so that glucose gets used properly. Thyroxines, same deal. Metabolism, they jack up metabolism. All right, and so these many cells in your body can't increase their metabolism unless they have glucose, and they're not going to uptake glucose unless insulin tells them to. So that one's not a surprise either. The glucocorticoids, cortisol, for example, and now that one's kind of like glucagon over here, because we said glucagon helps raise your blood glucose levels. The glucocorticoids help raise your blood glucose levels, right? And insulin is supposed to decrease those levels. So, why in the world would those two things stimulate insulin release? But when you think about it, they're causing your blood glucose levels to go up, but then you're going to need a little insulin around to tell certain cells in your body, hey, you need to it's time for you to take in this glucose that you're supposed to be using to support your energy needs. Somatostatin, that is a hormone that more or less does the opposite of what growth hormone does. It can actually inhibit insulin release. The sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, triggers fight or flight like epinephrine and norepinephrine, and so that makes sense. I mean, you're going to have to use your skeletal muscles during fight or flight, just like we were talking about, so they're going to need to take up glucose, and they need insulin to tell them to do that. All right, how about homeostatic imbalances? Okay, so diabetes mellitus, or DM, that's an abbreviation you'll see quite a bit for diabetes mellitus. This is the type of diabetes that we hear the most about, and it's the one that is due to problems with insulin. This is not the same. So we've talked about diabetes insipidus before. If you remember, that is that's a problem where you have hyposecretion of ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and so you wind up peeing too much. You wind up not being able to reabsorb water out of the urine, and you have excess urination and dehydration associated with that. Diabetes mellitus, now just like with diabetes insipidus, you do urinate excessively when you have diabetes, but it's due to a different reason. Okay, type 1 versus type 2, you've probably heard those terms before. If you have type 1 diabetes mellitus, that's the juvenile onset type. That's type 1. That is due to hyposecretion of insulin. And so that's why insulin is incredibly important for you to maintain your blood sugar levels where they need to be. So if you're not making enough of it, you got to take insulin injections to help control your blood sugar levels. So they're insulin dependent. They have to take insulin injections. Type 2, and this is the more common type, this is the usually adult onset, although unfortunately we are beginning to see more young people who are developing type 2 diabetes very early in life. And this is the one that's more complicated, a little more difficult to understand, but it is due to hypoactivity of insulin. All right, so what's the difference between those two? Type 1, you don't make the insulin. Type 2, you make the insulin, but cells don't respond to it. They ignore it, so they don't take up the glucose from the bloodstream and the extracellular fluids. It just stays there because those cells don't respond properly to the insulin. Either way, your blood sugar levels stay too high when you have diabetes, and that causes a number of different types of things to happen. Nausea. A lot of times diabetics feel nauseated. Nausea, one of your responses to feeling nauseated is actually to increase your blood glucose levels even higher. That's due to the fight or flight type stress response. See, that's the bad thing with diabetes. The body gets stressed due to the diabetic condition, and as we talked about, one of the main responses to stress is to increase your blood glucose levels even higher. So it's kind of a positive feedback type thing in a way. You got diabetes, your blood glucose levels are high, that stresses out your body, so your body raises them even higher, so which is pretty disturbing when you think about it. Okay, major symptoms, things that are associated with diabetes mellitus. Glycosuria literally means glucose spilled into the urine. You have glucose in your urine. Now, ordinarily, in a healthy individual, the kidneys filter the blood to make urine, and at first, you do have the glucose gets filtered out of the blood and into your urine that you're making in your kidneys, but then your kidneys harvest that glucose back out, and they return it to the bloodstream, because you don't want to pee out glucose. Glucose is useful to the body. If you have diabetes and your glucose levels are super high in the bloodstream, your kidneys can't handle all that glucose. They can't reabsorb it all. It's too much of it. And so you do wind up urinating out glucose. In fact, that was one of the ways diabetes was discovered. You had physicians who noticed that patients with all of these symptoms that we now associate with diabetes had sweet urine. So apparently, yes, they were actually tasting it. Okay, so when your skeletal muscles cells and your fat cells and your liver not responding to insulin properly, well, those cells, they can't take up glucose, but they've got to use something for energy. So what happens is they wind up needing fats to be used instead. And so there are signals um, that develop that cause your blood lipid levels to be elevated. So you wind up with high levels of fats traveling through the bloodstream, and we talked about that with cortisol earlier. That's not good. That can lead to fatty deposits in your blood vessels, which can block them and can cause heart disease later. But all these lipids wind up being released out of your fat cells and into your bloodstream to feed all of these other parts of the body that are starving for energy because they can't take up glucose. When your cells use fats for energy rather than sugars, they make a type of waste product called ketones. That's a waste from breaking down fats for energy. And ordinarily normal levels of those are fine, but in diabetics they can overproduce those, and so they'll wind up in their urine. They can be detected in the urine. That's called ketonuria. If they build up too high in the blood, a diabetic can develop a condition called ketoacidosis. So that's low pH in the blood due to excess ketones. And hopefully you guys remember that the pH of human body fluid should be about 7.35 to 7.45. So if you're a diabetic and you're producing lots of these ketones, they can lower it below that homeostatic range, and it can cause death in extreme cases and severe cases. If ketoacidosis is not treated, let me erase this because it's getting kind of messy. One of the symptoms that develops is hyperpnea, that is a fast breathing rate. That is actually a response by your body to try to help bring your body fluid pH levels back into the normal range. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the respiratory system a little bit later into the semester. Heart activity, oxygen gas transport throughout the body, nervous system stops functioning properly, and that can lead to coma and death. All right, you may have heard of somebody before going into a diabetic coma, and that's often due to ketoacidosis when that happens. Ketones have a particular odor, and you can smell them on the breaths of people who are experiencing that condition. Another group of people who develop can overproduce ketones are people who go on extremely low carbohydrate diets. So they're not taking in carbs, so they're dependent upon breaking down fats for their energy needs, and they can overproduce ketones as well. Okay, a comparison of the two types of diabetes mellitus. So type 1, again, is the juvenile onset. That's where you don't produce insulin. And what happens is your own immune system attacks the beta cells of the pancreas and kills them. It's actually an autoimmune disease. Autoimmune self basically means attack of yourself by your immune system. Auto means self. Type 2, insulin resistance, also called insulin resistance. So the cells of your body that should respond to insulin quit doing it. So the beta cells still secrete insulin, the target cells ignore it. They're resistant to it. We still don't completely understand how this develops, but it's associated with one of the major things seems to be being excessively overweight. That's one of the things that seems to then lead to insulin resistance, and lack of exercise, poor diet. So all of those conditions are very common in the United States and other countries around the world like ours that have kind of similar lifestyles. And in fact, over here, type 2 diabetes, this chart's pretty disturbing because it's showing how many millions of people in the United States have type 2 diabetes. And right now, or in 2010, it was at 21 million. But the projections are if we don't turn the trend around by 2050, we're going to have 86.6 million type 2 diabetics in the United States. Now, hopefully that's pretty far down the road. Hopefully by then we'll have a better handle on how to reverse this trend where so many people are developing type 2 diabetes. All right, some other homeostatic imbalances of insulin. What if you overproduce insulin? That would be hyperinsulinism. And now that can be caused also by accident if you are a diabetic and you have to take insulin injections and you inject too much insulin. That can happen. An effect would be hypoglycemia. That makes sense. Insulin is telling cells to take up absorbed glucose. If you have too much of it around, they're going to take up too much glucose, and that's going to cause the glucose levels in your body fluids to drop super, super low, and that can cause anxiety, nervousness, disorientation, and could even cause death. And how do you treat it? And if you've ever known anybody who is a type 1 diabetic, you may have seen this happen with them before. And one of the things they can do is just ingest a lot of sugar, simple sugar, things with table type sugar in it, and that quickly gets converted to glucose and absorbed into the blood, and it can quickly help reverse the effects that you have there. Okay, so this table 16.4 from your textbook is showing you, it's pretty nice because it's kind of summarizing what's happening in these cases of diabetes mellitus and what some of the effects are and why. One thing I didn't mention earlier, I said diabetes mellitus increases your urine output. And why is that? Why do you pee so much? And it's due to osmotic diuresis. All right, so glucose is a solute. And remember, when you study osmosis, water is attracted to hydrophilic solutes. Glucose is hydrophilic, so it likes water. So if you have excess glucose in your urine, you're not really supposed to have any glucose in your urine, but if it's there, it's going to attract or hang on to water. Solutes attract water like magnets, hydrophilic solutes do. And so that's going to increase your urine volume, and you're going to pee out more water. And so that causes one of the signs of diabetes mellitus is polyuria. Polyuria means increased urination. Another symptom is polydipsia. Polydipsia is another major symptom of diabetes mellitus, and that's thirst. So why are you thirsty? You're thirsty because you're peeing out too much water, and so you become dehydrated. So that triggers dehydration, triggers the thirst response so that you'll drink more water. So polydipsia is another symptom of diabetes mellitus. The third one is polyphagia. Phage refers to eating. Poly means a lot more. So you tend to be hungry. You tend to want to eat more. And you know why? Well, because a lot of the cells in your body are starving. They don't have access to the, they're ignoring insulin. They're not taking up glucose, and they need energy. So that triggers the hunger response. So diabetics have these three. These are the three major signs and symptoms of diabetes: polyuria, polydipsia, and polyphagia. So you should be aware of that and what those things mean. Okay, and then we also talked about already some of the things that can happen down on this part of the chart with, you know, you're not breaking down glucose, so instead you're breaking down these lipids, and that causes ketones to be produced, and then when ketones build up, that can cause a number of different problems, including ketoacidosis. All right, so we'll be doing some activities and things on Blackboard to talk about diabetes mellitus even a bit more, because that is such a common condition, so it is something you need to understand and be familiar with before you start moving into your healthcare fields. Okay, so the next lecture is actually the last one for the Unit 1 physiology, and it's going to be, we're going to kind of hit some highlights on some other endocrine hormones and talk a little bit about what happens to our endocrine systems as we age.